monitor screamed a flat, continuous tone. 0 pulse. The attending physician stepped back, hands raised, officially calling the time of death. But the bleeding man on the stainless steel table wasn't just anyone, he was the ruthless head of the city's deadliest syndicate. As the medical team surrendered to the inevitable, a 23-year-old nurse climbed onto the gurney, lacing her fingers over his shattered chest. She was ordered to stop. She refused. 47 seconds later, she didn't just restart a dead man's heart, she claimed it. The clock in Trauma Bay, 1 read 2:14 a.m. St. Jude's Memorial Hospital was usually a war zone on a rainy Friday night in Chicago, but nothing could have prepared the graveyard shift for the storm that was about to blow through the emergency room doors. Rachel Hayes stood near the nurse's station nursing a styrofoam cup of black coffee that tasted like burnt copper. At 23, she had already seen enough gunshot wounds and shattered bones to last a lifetime. She was a trauma nurse by trade, but a survivor by nature. Growing up in the foster system had stripped away her capacity for panic, replacing it with a cold, analytical calm that made her the best in the ER. Outside, the relentless Midwestern rain hammered against the reinforced glass. There were no ambulance sirens. That was the first sign something was horribly wrong. Instead of the familiar wail of EMS, the screech of heavy military-grade tires tore through the quiet. 4 matte black Cadillac Escalades jumped the curb, barricading the ambulance bay. The automatic doors didn't just open, they were violently shoved off their tracks by men wearing tailored Italian suits underneath tactical Kevlar vests. "Clear the floor!" a voice roared. It wasn't a request. It was an absolute command that vibrated with lethal authority. Rachel dropped her coffee. It splattered across the linoleum, forgotten, as 5 men rushed into the ER, carrying a makeshift stretcher. On it was a man drowning in his own blood. The security guards stationed at the entrance didn't even reach for their weapons. They took one look at the men specifically, the towering, heavily scarred enforcer leading the pack, Lorenzo Enzo Moretti, and immediately backed away with their hands raised. Everyone in Chicago knew who Enzo worked for, which meant the man bleeding out on the canvas was none other than Caleb Rossi. Caleb Rossi wasn't just a mobster. He was the architect of the city's underworld, a ghost who controlled politicians, judges, and the docks with an iron fist. Seeing him here completely vulnerable and saturated in dark arterial blood felt like watching a god fall from the sky. "I need a doctor right fucking now!" Enzo bellowed, grabbing the nearest resident by the collar of his scrubs and hurling him toward the stretcher. Dr. Harrison Brooks, the senior attending on duty, froze. The color drained from his face as he looked at the submachine gun slung over the shoulders of Caleb's men. "Trauma Bay 1, Brooks finally choked out. "Move him!" Rachel didn't freeze. Protocol kicked in. She sprinted to the bay, pulling on sterile gloves, her mind instantly compartmentalizing the terror radiating from her colleagues. They hoisted Caleb onto the trauma table. His custom charcoal suit was shredded, soaked through with a terrifying volume of blood. Rachel grabbed trauma shears and began cutting away the expensive wool and silk, exposing the catastrophic damage. "Talk to me," Rachel demanded, looking directly at Enzo, completely ignoring the fact that he was currently holding a Glock 19 at his side. "Where was he hit? How long ago?" Enzo blinked momentarily, taken aback by the young nurse's utter lack of fear. 3 times, chest, abdomen, and shoulder, 10 minutes ago, an ambush at the shipyard. "Get me 2 large-bore IVs, stat," Dr. Brooks yelled, his voice cracking. He was sweating profusely. "We need the massive transfusion protocol. Oh, negative. Bring the cooler Rachel pressure on the abdominal wound." Rachel pressed a thick stack of trauma dressings against Caleb's stomach, leaning her entire body weight into it to stem the hemorrhagic flow. Beneath her hands, the mafia boss was terrifyingly still. Even pale and dying, Caleb Rossi was a striking man. Sharp, aristocratic features, a hard jawline covered in dark stubble and raven black hair plastered to his forehead with sweat and rain. He looked like a fallen prince of darkness. "Pressure is tanking," shouted Sarah, another nurse. 60/40. Heart rate is 140 and climbing. "He's going into hypovolemic shock." Dr. Brooks panicked, struggling to insert a chest tube as Caleb's lung began to collapse from the thoracic wound. Blood bubbled violently from the incision site. "Damn it, I can't get the angle, there's too much blood." "Move. Move, doctor," Rachel said sharply. She didn't wait for him to step aside. She reached in, guiding the tube with expert precision through the intercostal space until she heard the sickening, satisfying pop of the pleural lining, followed by a rush of trapped air and blood draining into the Pleurovac system. "Pulse is dropping," Sarah screamed. "Heart rate 180, 200, he's in V-fib." The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor suddenly devolved into a frantic, chaotic alarm. Caleb's body seized on the table, a violent shudder ripping through his muscles as his heart stopped pumping blood and began uselessly quivering. "Crash cart!" Rachel yelled, abandoning the abdominal pressure to grab the defibrillator paddles. "Charge to 200 joules. Clear," Dr. Brooks shouted. Caleb's body arched off the table as the electric shock hit him. The monitor paused. Everyone held their breath. Enzo had his gun raised, pointing it blindly at the ceiling. His jaw clenched so hard, a muscle ticked violently in his cheek. Then, the monitor changed. It wasn't a rhythm. It was worse. B. A flat line, a systole. "Push 1 milligram of epinephrine," Dr. Brooks ordered, his voice hollow. "Starting compressions." Brooks climbed onto the step stool and began chest compressions. The sound of Caleb's ribs cracking under the force echoed sickeningly in the quiet room. 1 minute passed. 2 minutes. 3 rounds of epinephrine were pushed into Caleb's veins. Nothing changed. The monitor continued its monotonous, soul-crushing scream. Brooks was panting, his arms giving out. He looked at the monitor, then down at Caleb's lifeless face. He stepped down from the stool. "Stop!" Dr. Brooks whispered. "Stop CPR!" Rachel stared at him. "It's only been 4 minutes, doctor." "He's bled out, Rachel. There's no volume left to pump. He has massive internal trauma. He's gone." Dr. Brooks looked at the clock, terror in his eyes, as he realized he was about to deliver a death sentence in front of 5 heavily armed mobsters. Time of death, 2:43 a.m. Silence fell over Trauma Bay 1. It was a heavy, suffocating silence broken only by the continuous, mocking wail of the flatline. Enzo stepped forward. The sheer predatory menace rolling off the man was enough to make Sarah, the assisting nurse, burst into quiet tears. Enzo didn't shout. He didn't scream. He walked right up to Dr. Brooks, grabbed him by the throat with one massive hand, and slammed him against the glass wall of the trauma bay. The glass cracked. "You fix him!" Enzo whispered, his voice, a gravelly rasp of pure violence. He pressed the barrel of his Glock directly beneath Dr. Brooks's chin. "Or none of you leave this room alive." I can't." Brooks choked out, tears of terror leaking from his eyes. "He's medically dead. I'm sorry." Rachel looked at Caleb. His skin was graying, the life entirely drained from him. But she had felt something when she was holding pressure on his chest. A subtle underlying resilience. A man who ruled an empire didn't just die on a cold Tuesday morning because of a few bullets. She looked at the clock. 7 seconds had passed since Brooks called the time of death. Screw protocol, Rachel thought. Without a word, Rachel climbed directly onto the stainless steel trauma bed straddling Caleb Rossi's hips. She interlocked her fingers, placed the heel of her hand directly over his sternum, locked her elbows, and threw her upper body weight down. Crack! "Rachel, what are you doing?" Brooks gasped, struggling against Enzo's grip. "He's dead. It's over." "Shut up, Harrison!" Rachel snapped, her voice cutting through the room with startling ferocity. She pumped hard and fast. 1, 2, 3, 4. "Push another epi!" she screamed at Sarah. Sarah was frozen. "I said push the damn epi, Sarah!" Rachel roared. Sarah jolted to life, snapping the vial into the syringe and pushing the drug into Caleb's IV line. 15 seconds. The flat line continued. Rachel's shoulders burned. CPR was physically agonizing work. It required a violent mechanical rhythm. You had to compress the chest at least 2 inches, crushing the heart between the sternum and the spine, forcing the blood to circulate manually. 25 seconds. Enzo slowly lowered Dr. Brooks to the floor, stepping closer to the bed. The mobsters watched in stunned silence as this tiny blonde nurse with blood smeared across her forehead fought death in a literal cage match over their boss's body. "Come on!" Rachel hissed through her teeth, sweat dripping from her nose onto Caleb's motionless chest. "You don't get to die here. Not on my table. Come back." 35 seconds. Her arms felt like lead. Her lungs burned. The hospital's strict policy was clear. Once an attending physician calls a code, nurses must step down. Continuing CPR without a doctor's order was grounds for immediate termination, possibly even the loss of her medical license. She didn't care. The only thing that mattered was the man beneath her. 40 seconds. "Nurse," Enzo said softly. "It's over." "No," Rachel grunted, pushing down again harder this time. She leaned in close to Caleb's ear, her voice dropping to a fierce, commanding whisper. "Caleb, breathe. I'm not letting you go. Breathe." 45 seconds. Rachel raised her hands for the next compression, her muscles screaming in agony. 47 seconds. "Beep!" Rachel froze her hands, hovering an inch above his chest. "Beep! Beep!" The flat line broke. A jagged, irregular wave spiked across the monitor, then another and another. The rhythm was weak, sluggish, and desperate, but it was there. Sinus bradycardia. The heart was beating on its own. The entire room erupted into chaos, but this time, it was the chaos of life. "We have a pulse," Sarah shrieked, staring at the monitor as if it were a miracle. Dr. Brooks scrambled off the floor, his professional disbelief overridden by pure shock. "BP is 70/40. He's back. Oh my God, he's back. Get the surgical team on the line. We need an OR right now." Rachel slowly climbed off the bed, her legs trembling so violently she almost collapsed when her feet hit the floor. Enzo caught her. The massive mobster's grip on her arm wasn't threatening this time. It was steadying. He looked down at her, his dark eyes filled with something entirely new, absolute unwavering reverence. Caleb Rossi was rushed through the double doors toward the surgical wing, surrounded by his armed guard and a frantic team of surgeons. Rachel stood alone in the center of the bloody trauma bay. She looked at her trembling, blood-soaked hands. She had crossed a line tonight. She had defied a doctor-broken protocol and manually dragged the devil himself out of hell. She just didn't know yet that hell was about to follow her home. 3 days passed. The rain over Chicago finally broke, giving way to a suffocating, muggy heat. St. Jude's Memorial Hospital was technically operating as usual, but the atmosphere on the 4th floor was completely altered. The East Wing Intensive Care Unit had been entirely bought out. Every other patient was relocated. The entrances to the wing were manned by plainclothes security contractors who politely but firmly searched everyone who stepped off the elevator. Even the hospital administrator didn't dare complain. An anonymous donation of $5 million had been wired to the hospital's charity fund the morning after Caleb's surgery, buying the syndicate absolute autonomy. Caleb Rossi had survived a 7-hour surgery to repair his aorta, extract 2 hollow point bullets from his abdomen, and reconstruct his shattered clavicle. He had been in a medically induced coma since Tuesday. Rachel was exhausted. She had tried to go back to her normal ER rotation, to forget the feeling of Caleb's ribs giving way under her hands, to forget the sheer intensity of the 47 seconds he was dead. But Enzo had other plans. When she clocked in for her night shift on Friday, the charge nurse pulled her aside, looking terrified. "You've been reassigned," she whispered. "4th floor, ICU, room 412. "I'm an ER nurse," Rachel argued. "I don't do long-term critical care." "Tell that to the men upstairs," the charge nurse replied grimly. "They made it very clear. They only want you touching him. If you refuse, they said they'll pull him out of the hospital AMA and take him to a private clinic. Rachel, he's barely stable. If they move him, he dies. You have to go." Rachel swallowed hard, her pulse ticking up. She adjusted her scrubs, took a deep breath, and took the elevator to the 4th floor. When the doors parted, Enzo was waiting. He looked her up and down, nodding once in approval. "Nurse Hayes." "It's Rachel," she said coldly, walking past him. "I don't like being summoned like a dog, Mr. Moretti." Enzo smirked, a rare expression on his battered face. You saved his life when the man with the degree gave up. Caleb owes you a life debt. In our world, that means you are protected. It also means we trust no one else. Rachel stopped outside room 412. Is he awake? They took him off the paralytics and sedation 2 hours ago. He's fighting the ventilator. He's in pain. He won't let the other nurses near him to adjust his lines. Go in. Rachel pushed open the heavy oak door of the VIP suite. The room was shrouded in darkness, illuminated only by the sterile glow of the medical monitors. It smelled of antiseptic and expensive cologne. Caleb lay in the center of the bed, even hooked up to a dozen tubes with his skin pallid and his massive chest heavily bandaged. He emanated an oppressive aura of power. The ventilator had been removed, replaced by a simple nasal cannula. As Rachel stepped closer, her soft-soled shoes making almost no sound, his eyes snapped open. They were the color of dark, stormy ocean water, a piercing, intelligent blue that seemed to see right through her. He didn't look drugged or disoriented. He looked like a predator trapped in a cage. Rachel maintained her professional composure, though her heart hammered against her ribs. She stepped up to the bedside, reaching for the IV pump to adjust his pain medication. Mr. Rossi, I'm Rachel. I'm going to... Before she could finish her sentence, Caleb's left hand shot out. Despite his injuries, his grip was iron tight. His large hand wrapped around her wrist, halting her movement instantly. The sudden exertion made him wince, a sharp hiss escaping his lips, but he didn't let go. He pulled her slightly closer. You... His voice was a raspy, gravelly whisper destroyed by the breathing tube, yet it held a terrifyingly intimate edge. Let go of my wrist, Mr. Rossi, or I'll sedate you and tie you to the bed rails, Rachel said evenly. She didn't pull away, but she didn't cower either. Caleb stared at her, his chest heaving. The corners of his lips twitched upward into the ghost of a smile. He slowly released her wrist, though his eyes never left her face. I remember, he whispered, his gaze dropping to her lips before meeting her eyes again. Rachel paused, her fingers hovering over the IV buttons. Remember what you were unconscious. The dark, Caleb said, his voice straining. It was cold and quiet. And then, a voice, telling me not to die, telling me to breathe. He reached out again, much slower this time, his fingertips gently brushing the back of her hand. The contrast of his rough, calloused skin against her sterile gloves sent a strange, involuntary shiver up her arm. You pulled me back. It was my job, Rachel said softly, stepping back, desperate to put distance between them. The atmosphere in the room was too thick, too charged. You flatlined for 47 seconds. You're lucky to have brain function, let alone your memories. I don't believe in luck, Rachel, Caleb said, tasting her name on his tongue. He liked the sound of it. I believe in debts. Before Rachel could respond to the ominous promise in his words, the quiet of the ICU was shattered. It wasn't a loud noise. It was a subtle, muffled thwip out in the hallway, the unmistakable sound of a suppressed weapon. Caleb's demeanor changed instantly. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by the lethal instincts of a cartel boss. He tried to sit up, groaning in agony as his torn muscles screamed in protest. Get down! Caleb ordered, his eyes darting toward the door. Rachel froze. What? I said get the fuck down. Caleb reached out, grabbing the collar of her scrubs and yanking her forcefully down onto the floor beside his bed, just as the heavy wooden door to the suite splintered. Two men dressed in hospital scrubs, wearing surgical masks, stepped into the room. They weren't doctors. The suppressed handguns in their hands made that abundantly clear. The hitmen hadn't finished the job at the shipyard, and they had come to the hospital to correct their mistake. Rachel knelt on the cold floor, her breath caught in her throat. She looked up at Caleb. He was unarmed, critically injured, and bleeding through his bandages from the sudden exertion. But as he looked down at her, his eyes were devoid of fear. Stay behind me, little nurse, Caleb whispered, reaching under his mattress and pulling out a sleek black Sig Sauer P226 that Enzo had clearly smuggled in for him. Let's see if that heart you restarted still works. The air in the VIPICU suite evaporated, replaced by the acrid metallic sting of gunpowder. Caleb Razi, a man who had his chest cracked open by a rib spreader less than 72 hours ago, moved with the terrifying fluidity of a cornered apex predator. The first hitman leveled his suppressed weapon toward the bed, expecting a sedated, helpless target. Instead, he found the ghost of Chicago's underworld waiting for him. Pfft, pfft. Caleb fired twice. The heavy 9mm hollow point rounds from the Sig Sauer caught the first assassin dead in the chest, the kinetic force lifting the man off his feet and throwing him backward into the hallway. The second hitman flinched, ducking behind the heavy oak doorframe. He returned fire blindly. Smash! A bullet shattered the Medtronic heart monitor above the bed, raining sparks and jagged plastic down on Rachel. She was curled into a tight ball on the floor, her hands clamped over her ears, her medical training utterly useless in the face of flying lead. Stay down, Caleb gritted out. The physical toll of firing the heavy weapon was instantaneous and catastrophic. Caleb let out a guttural, choked groan, his free hand flying to his bandaged chest. The violent recoil and sudden muscle contraction had done the unthinkable. Beneath his surgical dressings, the heavy silk sutures holding his sternum together strained. The fresh incision line running down his abdomen tore open. Bright arterial blood immediately bloomed through the thick white gauze, soaking his hospital gown in seconds. "Caleb, you're tearing your stitches!" Rachel screamed over the ringing in her ears, her eyes locked on the expanding red stain. "Worry about the guy with the gun, Rachel!" He snapped back, his breathing ragged. He was losing strength. The color was draining from his face, leaving him a ghastly translucent white. His hand trembled as he kept the gun trained on the doorway. The hitman, realizing the boss was alone and injured, leaned around the doorframe. Rachel didn't think. The pure, unadulterated survival instinct that had kept her alive in Chicago's worst foster homes took over. She was kneeling next to the heavy metal oxygen cylinder strapped to the wall. "Hey!" Rachel shrieked at the top of her lungs. The hitman's eyes darted toward her for a fraction of a second. In that microsecond, Rachel grabbed a heavy stainless steel surgical tray from the bedside table and hurled it like a frisbee directly at the man's face. It wasn't a lethal blow, but the heavy metal edge clipped his nose with a sickening crunch. He stumbled back, his gun firing wildly into the ceiling. Caleb didn't miss his window. He fired his last 3 rounds. The hitman dropped like a stone, a neat dark hole appearing directly between his eyes. Silence slammed back into the room, heavy and absolute, broken only by the chaotic hissing of severed oxygen lines and Caleb's wet, ragged breathing. "Clear!" a voice roared from the hallway. Enzo burst through the shattered doorway, a custom AR-15 assault rifle tucked tightly into his shoulder. He scanned the room, stepped over the dead bodies, and immediately dropped his weapon to his side when he saw Caleb slumped against the pillows covered in blood. 3 more of Caleb's men flooded the corridor, securing the perimeter. "Boss!" Enzo breathed, his scarred face pale. "I'm alive, Enzo." Caleb rasped, his eyes fluttering as shock began to set in. The adrenaline spike was crashing, leaving him intimately acquainted with the agonizing reality of his torn body. "But I think I'm leaking." Rachel scrambled up from the floor. The terror of the gunfire vanished instantly, replaced by clinical cold urgency. She ripped the ruined hospital gown away from his chest. "He has massive wound dehiscence." Rachel ordered, her hands moving frantically as she grabbed thick trauma pads from the shattered supply cart. "The abdominal incision tore open. He's bleeding out again. I need pressure and I need a surgical stapler." "Now?" Enzo didn't question her. He barked an order to one of his men in Italian. Rachel pressed her hands down hard on Caleb's stomach, trying to hold the separated muscle tissue together to stem the bleeding. Caleb let out a raw, agonizing cry, his back arching off the bed. I know it hurts, but if I don't hold this, your intestines are going to eviscerate." Rachel said, her voice shaking, but her hands rock steady. "Look at me, Caleb. Keep your eyes on me." Caleb's head rolled to the side. his stormy blue eyes locked onto hers. Even through the blinding haze of pain, the intensity of his stare felt like a physical weight. "You threw a tray at an armed man." "I missed his eye," Rachel muttered, pressing down harder. "Don't talk. Your blood pressure is crashing." "They had key cards," Enzo said, his voice deadly quiet. He was inspecting the dead man by the door. These weren't random thugs. This was a professional hit squad from the rival outfit, and they had hospital employee access badges. Someone inside St. Jude's sold us out. Caleb's jaw clenched. "We are compromised. We can't stay here." Enzo agreed. He looked at Rachel. "Can he be moved?" "Moved!" Rachel snapped, staring at the mafia enforcer like he was insane. "Are you out of your mind? He just had open heart surgery. His abdominal wall is ripped open. If you put him in a bumpy car, he will bleed to death before you reach the interstate. If we stay here, the police lock down the building. The feds take custody of him and the rival cartel finishes the job in lockup," Enzo stated coldly. "We have a secure trauma suite at a safe house, private doctors. We are moving him now." "I am officially stepping in and saying absolutely not," Rachel said firmly. Caleb reached up, his bloody fingers wrapping weakly around Rachel's wrist. "Rachel," he whispered, his voice fading, "I'm a dead man if I stay in this bed. Patch me up and come with us." "I am not a mob doctor." Rachel panicked, her eyes darting between Caleb and the heavily armed men. "I'm a civilian. My shift ends in 3 hours. Enzo stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "They saw your face, Rachel. The security cameras caught you fighting back. If the police don't arrest you as an accomplice, the cartel will hunt you down for interfering. You're in the game now. You don't have a choice." Rachel looked down at her hands stained crimson with Caleb Rossi's blood for the second time in 3 days. Her normal life, her burnt coffee, her quiet apartment, her predictable ER shifts was gone. It had died the moment she refused to stop CPR. One of Enzo's men rushed in with a sterile surgical stapler looted from a supply closet. "Fine," Rachel choked out, grabbing the stapler. "Hold him down. This is going to be medieval." Enzo pinned Caleb's shoulders to the mattress. Rachel didn't hesitate. Without anesthesia, she pinched the torn edges of his abdominal wound together and fired the heavy stainless steel staples directly into his flesh. Click, click, click. Caleb bit straight through his lower lip to keep from screaming, his body vibrating with agony. By the 10th staple, the bleeding slowed to a manageable seep. By the 15th, he passed out entirely. "Let's move," Enzo ordered. "Bring the nurse." The escape from St. Jude's was a masterclass in organized criminal efficiency. There were no screeching tires or blazing guns. Instead, Enzo's men utilized a private unmarked ambulance leased under the Shell Corporation name Garda World Logistics. It was heavily armored, equipped with bulletproof glass and run-flat tires, looking completely innocuous from the outside. Rachel was shoved into the back of the rig alongside Caleb's unconscious strapped-down body. Enzo climbed into the front passenger seat, and they pulled out of the hospital loading dock just as the first wave of Chicago Police Department cruisers swarmed the main entrance, their sirens wailing uselessly in the distance. The back of the ambulance was claustrophobic, smelling sharply of bleach copper and adrenaline. Rachel worked frantically in the dim overhead lights. She had hung a fresh bag of O-negative blood and 0.9% normal saline, watching the fluids drip into Caleb's central line. "His pressure is 85/50, Rachel shouted to the front cab over the rumble of the engine. "He needs real surgical intervention, Enzo. My staples are a Band-Aid on a dam break." 10 minutes, Enzo called back. "Keep him alive." Rachel sat back on the small jump seat, wiping a mixture of sweat and blood from her forehead. She looked at Caleb. The harsh, fluorescent light cast deep, hollow shadows under his cheekbones. He looked incredibly frail, a stark contrast to the terrifying authority he had commanded just an hour ago. "What am I doing?" Rachel thought, her hands shaking as the adrenaline finally began to recede, leaving behind a cold, paralyzing dread. "I'm in an armored truck with the most dangerous men in the state. I'm harboring a fugitive." She reached into her scrub pocket and felt her cell phone. The screen was cracked. She could dial 911. She could drop a pin with her location, But as she looked at Caleb's chest, watching the shallow, uneven rise and fall of the heart she had literally beaten back to life, she knew she wouldn't do it. He was a monster to the rest of the world. But to Rachel, he was her patient, and she had never lost a patient she fought this hard for. The ambulance took a sharp turn, the tires humming smoothly against the wet asphalt of Lakeshore Drive. Through the heavily tinted rear window, Rachel saw the shimmering lights of the city skyline reflecting off Lake Michigan. They were heading north, toward the Gold Coast, the wealthiest, most heavily secured neighborhood in Chicago. The vehicle pulled into a subterranean parking garage beneath a towering, ultra-luxury high-rise located just blocks from the Drake Hotel. The gates closed behind them, sealing them in a concrete fortress. "We're here," Enzo announced, throwing the rear doors open. "Get him out, smooth and steady." Two men helped Rachel unlatch the stretcher. They rolled Caleb to a private fingerprint-secured elevator. Enzo scanned his hand and the doors glided open. There were no buttons inside. The elevator moved purely by biometric command, shooting upwards at a stomach-dropping speed until it chimed softly at the penthouse level. When the doors opened, Rachel gasped. The penthouse wasn't just a home. It was a fortress, masked in unimaginable luxury. Floor-to-ceiling bulletproof windows offered a panoramic view of the dark, churning lake. Modern art hung on Venetian plaster walls and the floors were imported black marble. But what caught Rachel's attention was the massive dining room. The mahogany dining table had been pushed aside. In its place was a state-of-the-art, fully sterile surgical suite. High-powered LED operating lights hung from the ceiling. A crash cart, an anesthesia machine, and racks of surgical instruments were perfectly organized. Waiting for them was a man in sterile scrubs. He looked to be in his 60s, balding with a pair of sharp, wire-rimmed glasses. "Dr. Aris," Enzo said, wheeling Caleb in. He tore his abdominal sutures, massive blood loss. The nurse stapled him to keep him together. Dr. Aris, an underground surgeon who had clearly lost his license long ago but retained his skills, looked at the crude staples holding Caleb's stomach together. He raised an eyebrow and looked at Rachel. "Sloppy but effective," Aris muttered. "You saved his life, nurse. Again. Go scrub in. I need a competent first assist. These goons don't know a scalpel from a butter knife." Rachel didn't argue. She moved to the industrial sink installed near the kitchen, scrubbing her hands and forearms with harsh iodine soap until her skin burned. When she returned, she was gowned and gloved, stepping into the glaring light of the makeshift OR. For the next 4 hours, Rachel and Dr. Aris fought to undo the damage of the shootout. They removed Rachel's frantic staples, cleaned the abdominal cavity, clamped the bleeding vessels, and meticulously resutured the muscle and fascia layers. Rachel worked with a mechanical precision, her mind blanking out everything except the surgical field. It was dawn when Dr. Aris finally tied the last knot. "He'll live," Aris sighed, stripping off his bloody gloves. "But he can't move for at least 2 weeks. If he tears these internal stitches again, he's dead, and I won't be able to fix it." Aris packed his bags and left out the back service elevator. Rachel was left alone in the massive penthouse with Caleb, who had been moved to a king-sized bed in the master suite, and Enzo, who stood guard by the door like a gargoyle. The morning sun began to creep over Lake Michigan, casting a golden, ethereal light into the room. Rachel sat in a plush velvet armchair next to Caleb's bed. She felt completely hollowed out, running on nothing but fumes and leftover adrenaline. Caleb's head shifted on the pillow. The anesthesia was wearing off. His eyelashes fluttered and he let out a low, rough sigh. "Rachel," he murmured, his voice thick with drugs. She leaned forward. "I'm here." He slowly opened his eyes. The stormy blue was hazy, heavily dilated, but unmistakably focused on her. He didn't look at the luxurious room. He didn't ask about his men or the hitmen. He just looked at the young woman in bloody scrubs sitting beside him. "You didn't run," he stated softly. "You kidnapped me." "Mr. Rossi," Rachel replied, her voice laced with exhaustion and a hint of dark humor. "And I don't think my Honda Civic can outrun an armored truck." A low rumble of laughter vibrated in Caleb's chest, abruptly cut off by a wince of pain. He reached his hand across the crisp white sheets. Rachel hesitated. Then slowly, she reached out, letting him wrap his large, warm hand around hers. His thumb weakly stroked her knuckles. "You belong to me now, Rachel." Caleb whispered the possessiveness in his tone, sending a jolt straight down her spine. It wasn't a threat. It sounded like an unbreakable vow. "I protect what's mine. They will never touch you." Rachel stared at the notorious mafia boss, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had restarted his heart, but as she sat in the golden morning light of the cartel's fortress, she realized he had just entirely consumed hers. The line between captive and caretaker had blurred, and there was no going back to the ER. She squeezed his hand back. "Get some sleep, Caleb," she whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." 2 weeks in the Gold Coast penthouse felt like an eternity suspended in amber. The sprawling 10,000-square-foot fortress overlooking Lake Michigan had become Rachel's entire universe. Outside the bulletproof glass, Chicago moved on. She watched the ant-like traffic crawling along Lakeshore Drive and the distant Ferris wheel at Navy Pier spinning silently in the summer haze. Her old life, the cramped apartment in Logan Square, the grueling ER shifts at St. Jude's, the cheap burnt coffee felt like a dream belonging to a different woman. Caleb Rossi was the worst patient Rachel had ever encountered and the most captivating. By day 6, the heavy painkillers had been entirely metabolized out of his system. He refused anything stronger than a standard dose of ibuprofen, claiming narcotics clouded his judgment. For a man recovering from massive cardiothoracic trauma and severe abdominal dehiscence, it was a masochistic display of willpower. "You're pushing your heart rate into the 120s, Rachel scolded, her hands resting firmly on her hips as she stood over his bed. It was a Tuesday morning, and the penthouse was bathed in crisp, cool light. "If you don't lie back down, I'm going to push 50 milligrams of propofol into your IV and put you down myself." Caleb was sitting on the edge of the mattress, his broad back rigid with pain, clutching a secure, encrypted tablet. His dark hair was slightly longer now, falling into his stormy blue eyes. He looked up at her, a dangerous, predatory smirk playing on his lips. "You threaten me a lot for a woman who technically works for me." Caleb rumbled, his voice a deep, gravelly vibration that sent a familiar flutter through Rachel's stomach. "I don't work for you. I am a hostage with a nursing degree." Rachel shot back, though the bite in her voice had softened over the past 14 days. She stepped closer, unceremoniously snatching the tablet out of his hands. "It's time to change your dressings. Lie down." Caleb sighed, the fight draining out of him. With Rachel, and only with Rachel, the ruthless head of the Chicago syndicate yielded. He leaned back against the plush pillows, his eyes never leaving her face, as she pulled on a pair of sterile purple nitrile gloves. She carefully peeled back the heavy gauze over his chest. The angry red incision dividing his sternum was healing beautifully, the swelling significantly reduced. She moved lower to the brutal staple line tracking across his abdomen. As she worked cleaning the wounds with saline and applying fresh bacitracin ointment, the silence between them grew thick and charged. Caleb's hand lifted his calloused fingertips, lightly brushing against the bare skin of her forearm above her glove. "You have a delicate touch for someone so abrasive," he murmured. Rachel swallowed hard, trying to ignore the heat radiating from his skin. "If I wasn't delicate, you'd bleed out on your imported Italian sheets." "Gene, Dominic Valenti is making moves," Caleb said suddenly, the shift in topic giving Rachel cognitive whiplash. Rachel paused, holding a fresh strip of medical tape. Dominic Valenti. She had heard Enzo whispering the name in the hallway. Valenti was the head of the rival faction operating out of the South Side, the man responsible for the ambush at the shipyard and the hitman at the hospital. "Why are you telling me this?" Rachel asked quietly. "Because you are in this now, Rachel. Valenti controls the ports. He thinks because I've been quiet for 2 weeks, I'm weak. Or dead." Caleb's jaw clenched, his eyes darkening to the color of bruised iron. "He bought off someone in my inner circle, someone who knew my location at the docks, someone who bypassed the security at St. Jude's." "A mole," Rachel breathed, taping down the final piece of gauze. "Yes." Caleb reached up his hand, wrapping gently around the back of her neck, pulling her down slightly so she had to look directly into his eyes. Enzo has narrowed the leak down to 3 men, my capos, men I grew up with, but I trust no one, except you. Rachel's heart hammered against her ribs. The sheer weight of his trust was terrifying. Caleb, I'm just a nurse. I don't know anything about your world. You know how to keep me breathing, Caleb whispered, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. His gaze dropped to her lips, the tension in the room skyrocketing from clinical to intensely intimate. And you know how to fight. You saved me twice, mia vita. My life. The Italian endearment slipped from his tongue, effortlessly wrapping around Rachel like a heavy velvet cloak. Before she could process the implication, a sharp knock shattered the moment. Enzo stepped into the room, his face grim. Boss, we have a problem. Caleb dropped his hand, the tender vulnerability vanishing instantly. He was the devil once more. Report. Matteo just arrived at the penthouse. Enzo said, his hand resting casually on the butt of the weapon holstered at his waist. He bypassed the lobby security check, said he had urgent financial ledgers from the offshore accounts that you needed to sign off on personally. Caleb's eyes narrowed. Matteo was his second in command, the man who had managed the syndicate's money laundering operations through Rush University Medical Center's shadow shell companies for a decade. Let him in, Caleb ordered coldly. But keep your hand on your gun, Enzo. Rachel, step away from the bed. The temperature in the master suite seemed to drop 10 degrees as Matteo entered. He was a slender, immaculately dressed man in a bespoke navy suit carrying an expensive leather briefcase. He looked more like a Wall Street hedge fund manager than a cartel underboss. When his eyes landed on Caleb sitting up in bed, a fleeting, almost imperceptible flash of surprise crossed his face. Rachel retreated to the corner of the room by the IV stand, her clinical instincts flaring. She watched human behavior for a living. She watched people lie about their drug use, their injuries, their pain levels. Matteo's posture was rigid. He was sweating slightly despite the penthouse's aggressive air conditioning. Caleb. Matteo said smoothly, though his voice tight. Praise God you're recovering. The streets are a mess. Valenti is claiming the South Side territory. We need your signature on the Cayman transfers to pay the police commissioner, or we lose our political cover. Bring the papers here, Caleb commanded, his voice devoid of emotion. Matteo approached the bed, opening the briefcase. He handed Caleb a stack of documents and a gold Mont Blanc pen. As Caleb began to read through the complex financial ledgers, Matteo turned his attention to the medical equipment. You have quite the setup here, Matteo commented casually, his eyes drifting to the IV bags hanging on the stainless steel pole next to Rachel. Is he receiving the best care, nurse? He's stable, Rachel said neutrally, crossing her arms. Good. He needs his rest. Matteo reached into his suit jacket. Dr. Aris asked me to bring a fresh vial of his antibiotics from the private clinic. Said you were running low on the... What was it? Cefazolin. Matteo pulled a small clear glass vial with a rubber stopper from his pocket and set it on the sterile tray next to the IV pump. Rachel frowned. Dr. Aris hadn't mentioned needing more cefazolin. She had restocked the supply just yesterday using the black market courier. She stepped forward, picking up the vial. The label looked perfect. It had the standard pharmaceutical barcode, the correct dosage instructions for 1 gram of cefazolin. But as Rachel tilted the vial against the light, her heart stopped. Antibiotics like cefazolin in their liquid state were ever so slightly viscous with a faint yellowish tint. The liquid inside this vial was crystal clear and moved with the exact viscosity of water. Rachel had seen this before. It looked exactly like potassium chloride. If potassium chloride was pushed rapidly into an IV line rather than heavily diluted, it caused immediate catastrophic cardiac arrest. It was the exact drug used in lethal injections. It wouldn't leave an obvious trace unless a medical examiner was specifically looking for it. And given Caleb's recent heart surgery, his death would be easily ruled as a sudden tragic myocardial infarction. Matteo. Rachel said, her voice eerily calm, though her hands trembled. Who handed you this vial? Matteo blinked, turning to her. One of Dr. Aris's technicians. Why? Rachel looked at Caleb. His stormy eyes were already locked on her, reading the sudden stark terror in her face. Because this isn't Cefazolin, Rachel said loudly, stepping directly between Matteo and Caleb's bed. It's a lethal dose of potassium. If I inject this into his line, his heart will stop in less than 30 seconds. The silence that followed was deafening. Matteo's facade cracked. His hand darted into his suit jacket, not for another pen, but for a snub-nosed revolver. He never even cleared the holster. Bang! The deafening roar of Enzo's suppressed Glock filled the room. Matteo's shoulder exploded in a mist of crimson, the kinetic force spinning him around. He crashed hard onto the black marble floor, screaming in agony as his weapon clattered uselessly out of reach. Caleb didn't flinch at the gunshot. He slowly placed the financial ledgers on his lap and looked down at the bleeding man writhing on his floor. "You sold me out to Valenti," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a terrifying demonic register. "You gave him the shipment schedule at the docks. You gave his men the employee badges for St. Jude's. He offered me half the city." "Caleb," Matteo gasped, clutching his shattered shoulder, blood pooling quickly on the pristine floor. "You're a ghost. You've been leading from the shadows for too long. The outfit needs a visible king. And you thought you could be a king by poisoning a man in his bed," Caleb sneered. He looked at Enzo. "Pick him up." Enzo hauled the screaming underboss to his knees. Caleb looked at Rachel. She was clutching the lethal vial, her chest heaving, staring at the blood rapidly staining the floor. This was the reality of the man she had saved. He wasn't just a tough patient. He was a ruthless judge, jury, and executioner. "Rachel," Caleb said softly, "look at me." She forced her eyes away from Matteo and met Caleb's gaze. "I told you I'd protect what's mine," Caleb said. He reached under his pillow, pulling out the same Sig Sauer P226 he had used at the hospital. He racked the slide. The metallic clack echoed brutally in the quiet room. "Caleb, don't," Rachel whispered, stepping forward. "Not in here. You'll tear your sutures." It was a ridiculous thing to say. A man was about to be executed in front of her, and her primary concern was her patient's surgical integrity. But it was all her panicked mind could process. Caleb's expression softened momentarily. A dark, twisted affection burned in his eyes. "For you, mia vita, I will be careful." He raised the weapon and fired a single round directly into Matteo's chest. The underboss collapsed dead before he hit the marble. Enzo didn't bat an eye. He grabbed Matteo by the collar of his ruined suit and dragged him out of the room, leaving a long, smeary trail of blood in his wake. "I'll call the cleaners, boss." Rachel stood frozen. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixed nauseatingly with the sterile scent of the medical supplies. She felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. Her knees buckled. Before she could hit the floor, Caleb was there. He had moved off the bed, ignoring the screaming pain in his abdomen, catching her in his arms. He pulled her against his chest, right over the heart she had refused to let die. "I've got you," Caleb murmured into her hair, holding her tightly as she trembled. "I've got you, Rachel. It's over. He was going to stop your heart." Rachel sobbed, burying her face into his solid shoulder. The reality of how close she had come to losing him broke the dam of her professional composure. "I almost injected it." "But you didn't," Caleb whispered fiercely, tilting her chin up so he could look at her. "Because you are the only one who sees everything. You are my savior, Rachel, my queen." And right there, surrounded by the blood of a traitor and the shadows of a cartel empire, Caleb Rossi leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was possessive bruising and desperate, a violent clash of life and death. Rachel kissed him back with equal ferocity, surrendering entirely to the dark, consuming gravity of the Chicago underworld. She had given him his life back. Now he was claiming hers. The kiss changed everything. The invisible barrier between the civilian nurse and the mafia don had been annihilated, replaced by a terrifying, intoxicating loyalty. Over the next 3 weeks, the Gold Coast penthouse transformed from a clandestine hospital into a war room. As Caleb's sternum knit together and his body regained its lethal muscular mass, his focus shifted entirely to the eradication of Dominic Valenti. Rachel no longer spent her days just monitoring Caleb's vitals. She was absorbed into the fabric of the syndicate. When Enzo returned from a brutal skirmish on the west side with a 9mm bullet grazed across his bicep, he didn't go to Dr. Aris. He sat at the marble kitchen island drinking a glass of scotch while Rachel expertly stitched his arm. "You're getting faster with those sutures, Doc," Enzo grunted, testing the tension in his arm. "If you idiots would stop getting shot, I wouldn't have to practice," Rachel replied dryly, snipping the surgical thread. Caleb watched them from the head of the dining table, which was currently covered in architectural blueprints, burner phones, and ledgers. He was dressed in a dark tailored dress shirt, the top buttons undone to accommodate the healing scars on his chest. The sight of Rachel, his savior, his quiet, fierce nurse casually repairing his most lethal enforcer, filled him with a dark, primal pride. "Valenti is getting desperate," Caleb announced, his voice carrying the deep, resonant authority that had returned as his lungs fully healed. "He bombed our front at the meatpacking plant last night. He's bleeding money and he knows I'm alive. The streets are talking." "Let me take a strike team to his compound in Oakbrook," Enzo said, standing up. "We can burn the whole place to the ground." "No," Caleb said smoothly, his eyes cold and calculating. "Valenti has Detective Thomas O'Connor from the Chicago PD Gang Intelligence Unit in his pocket. If we hit the compound, O'Connor will have SWAT swarming us before the smoke clears. We don't fight Valenti on his turf. We invite him to ours." Rachel paused as she washed her hands at the sink. "You want to invite the man trying to kill you to a parley? Caleb, your heart is still in recovery. You are on heavy beta blockers to prevent arrhythmias. If you get into a physical altercation, your blood pressure will spike and you could blow an aortic valve." Caleb stood up, walking slowly across the marble floor until he was standing directly behind Rachel. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his solid chest, his chin resting on the top of her head. "I am not going to fight him, Mia Vita," Caleb murmured, the vibration of his chest rumbling against her spine. "I am going to end him, but I need you to trust me." "What's the play, boss?" Enzo asked, pretending not to notice the intense intimacy between his boss and the trauma nurse. "We leak a rumor through our remaining men at the docks," Caleb instructed. "We tell them I'm suffering from severe post-surgical complications, that I'm weak, bedridden, desperate for a truce. We offer him the South Side territory in exchange for peace, and we tell him we'll sign the contracts at the abandoned rail yard in Pilsen. Neutral ground." "He'll bring an army," Enzo warned. "Let him—" Caleb smiled, a chilling shark-like expression. "Because we aren't bringing one." 2 nights later, the plan was set into motion. The air in Chicago was thick with the threat of an impending thunderstorm. The sky bruised purple and black over the city skyline. Rachel insisted on being in the heavily armored ambulance parked 2 blocks away from the Pilsen rail yard. She sat in the back with her medical bags packed, monitoring Caleb's heart rate via a telemetry patch taped to his chest. On the encrypted tablet in her hands, she watched his vitals. Heart rate 85 beats per minute, blood pressure 120/80. He was calm. Too calm for a man walking into a trap. Caleb stepped out of his black Escalade, flanked only by Enzo and 2 other trusted guards. The rail yard was desolate, illuminated only by the harsh flickering amber glow of the streetlights. Waiting for them was Dominic Valenti, surrounded by 20 heavily armed men with automatic rifles drawn. Through the hidden earpiece, Rachel could hear every word. "I have to admit, Rossi," Valenti's voice crackled over the comms, dripping with arrogant amusement. "I expected a ghost. You look like hell, and you brought 3 men to a war zone. You really have lost your touch." "I didn't come to start a war." Dominic Caleb's voice was smooth, betraying zero fear. Rachel watched his heart rate on the monitor. 82 beats per minute. He was literally lowering his pulse. "I came to finalize a transaction. The only transaction happening tonight is me taking your head," Valenti spat. He raised his hand, signaling his men to execute Caleb's tiny crew. "Before you do that," Caleb said, raising a single finger, "you might want to ask your men who signed their paychecks this morning." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the rail yard. Valenti frowned, looking to his left, then to his right. Matteo was a greedy fool. Caleb's voice echoed in the damp night air. "But he had access to my Cayman accounts. Accounts I drained yesterday. I didn't spend the money on lawyers, Dominic. I spent it on your lieutenants." Valenti's eyes widened in sudden horrifying realization. He turned to his second in command. "Shoot him!" Valenti screamed. The sound of 20 rifles being cocked simultaneously echoed like thunder. But not a single weapon was pointed at Caleb Rossi. Every single one of Valenti's men had turned their guns directly on Dominic Valenti. "You see, Dominic," Caleb said, taking a slow, measured step forward, "loyalty in your crew is bought. Loyalty in mine is earned. You thought I was bleeding out in a hospital bed, but I was buying your entire empire from underneath you." In the back of the ambulance, Rachel let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. Caleb's heart rate remained perfectly steady. It was a masterstroke of psychological and financial warfare. He hadn't fired a single shot, yet he had entirely dismantled his greatest enemy. "Rossi, please," Valenti stammered, raising his hands, his previous arrogance entirely evaporating as he stared down the barrels of his own men's weapons. "We can negotiate. We can split the city, 50-50. Caleb didn't smile. He looked at the man who had ordered his execution, the man who had sent hitmen into St. Jude's endangering Rachel's life. "There are no negotiations," Caleb said coldly. He didn't give an order. He didn't have to. Enzo drew his suppressed Glock and fired a single round. Valenti dropped to the gravel, dead before the echo of the gunshot faded. The rival syndicate was officially decapitated. The men lowered their weapons, bowing their heads slightly in submission to the true king of Chicago. Caleb turned to walk back to the Escalade. In the ambulance, Rachel watched the tablet. Suddenly, the steady green line on the telemetry monitor spiked wildly. Heart rate 140 beats per minute, 160, 180. "Caleb," Rachel screamed into the comms, "your heart rate is in ventricular tachycardia. Caleb, sit down right now." The adrenaline crash, combined with the extreme psychological stress and the heavy beta blockers, was sending his recovering heart into a dangerous electrical spiral. Through the comms, Rachel heard Caleb grunt in pain. "Enzo!" Caleb gasped out. "Boss is down!" Enzo yelled over the radio. Rachel didn't wait. She kicked open the back doors of the armored ambulance and sprinted down the dark, wet street toward the rail yard, entirely ignoring protocol safety and the 20 armed mercenaries standing in the gravel. Her medical bag banged against her hip as she ran. She found Caleb on his knees, clutching his chest, his face pale and covered in a cold sweat. Enzo was holding him up, panic etched across the enforcer's scarred face. "Move!" Rachel shouted, sliding into the gravel next to Caleb. She ripped open his dress shirt, exposing the telemetry leads and the angry red scar of his surgery. "Rachel!" Caleb choked, his eyes rolling back slightly. "Chest tight. You're having a run of V-TAC, you stubborn idiot," Rachel said, her voice shaking, but her hands moving with absolute precision. She pulled a pre-filled syringe of amiodarone from her kit. "Hold his arm steady, Enzo." Rachel found the vein in his forearm and pushed the anti-arrhythmic drug directly into his bloodstream. She grabbed Caleb's face in both of her hands, forcing him to look at her. "Caleb, look at me. Breathe with me. Deep breaths. You are not dying on me now. Do you hear me? We won. It's over. Breathe." Caleb locked his stormy blue eyes onto hers. Even in the midst of a cardiac event, the sight of her fierce, unyielding, demanding he live was the anchor his body needed. He took a ragged, deep breath. Then another. Slowly, the violent fluttering in his chest began to subside. The drug took effect, forcing his heart's electrical pathways back into a normal sinus rhythm. "Gotcha," Rachel whispered, resting her forehead against his, her own heart hammering wildly. "I've got you." Caleb weakly wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face in her neck, inhaling the scent of her skin. He didn't care that his new army of mercenaries was watching. He didn't care about the blood on the gravel. He only cared about the woman holding him together. Always, Caleb whispered against her skin. You always pull me back. 1 year later, the massive chandelier in the grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel cast a brilliant, glittering light over Chicago's elite. Politicians, judges, and business moguls clinked champagne glasses celebrating the annual charity gala for St. Jude's Memorial Hospital. At the center of the room stood Caleb Rossi. He looked immaculate in a custom black tuxedo, exuding an aura of absolute, untouchable power. There were no scars visible beneath his tailored clothes, and the city's underworld was quieter and more profitable than it had been in decades. But Caleb's eyes weren't on the mayor or the police commissioner. His gaze was locked on the woman walking down the grand staircase. Rachel wore a stunning floor-length emerald silk gown that clung to her curves, a diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. She was no longer the exhausted, coffee-stained trauma nurse working the graveyard shift. She moved with a regal, commanding grace. When the cartel's men saw her, they respectfully bowed their heads. They knew better than to cross the dawn, but they were absolutely terrified of the queen. Caleb met her at the bottom of the stairs, offering his arm. You look beautiful, Mrs. Rossi. Caleb murmured, his eyes dark with adoration and possession. And you look like a man who actually took his blood pressure medication this morning, Rachel teased, looping her arm through his. I have to. Caleb smiled, leaning down to press a soft kiss to her temple. My personal doctor is incredibly strict, and she happens to hold my heart in her hands. Rachel looked up at the man who had flatlined for 47 seconds, the man she had dragged back from the abyss. She squeezed his arm, feeling the strong, steady, unyielding beat of his pulse beneath his tuxedo jacket. Yes, she does, Rachel whispered, and she's never letting it go. What a wild, heart-stopping ride. From a desperate 47-second flatline in a bloody ER to the absolute peak of Chicago's criminal empire, Rachel and Caleb's story proves that sometimes the most dangerous love is the only one that can keep you alive. She didn't just save a mafia boss, she conquered his world and became its undisputed queen. If you were captivated by this intense, high-stakes medical mafia romance, hit that like button, share it with your fellow drama lovers, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling, real-life inspired stories that will leave you breathless.